listen. You know, when we think about traditional ways of doing social work, it's a lot of this sort of medical model approach. We know everything, we know it all. We're leading you to what we think where you need to be. And within that, a lot of times mistakes are made as we think about who these individuals are. And we sometimes lump people together. We see Black, we see Latino, we see Asian, we see people with a disability, and we have these preconceived perception or these ideas about who they are, this narrative. And I've learned that, you know, not only from a, you know, from a scholarly standpoint, but also from, you know, being just practicing, that everyone has unique stories, even within groups you may have had experiences with, but everyone has a unique story. As we think about, especially with my area, we think about oppression and we think about the effects of oppression. And we don't take enough time to listen, to allow people to divulge and to tell their truths before we're able to partner with anyone. I think that's the most important lesson I learned, is just to stop and listen.
Thank you. Dr. Lovato?
Yeah, thank you. Building off of Dr. Fitzgerald's response, I think I'm going to go a little bit different direction, which is I think being a social worker is such an amazing career and profession that allows for a ton of space in your career. I thought growing, you know, into my career in my early 20s that I would be a direct clinician and go on to get my LCSW and maybe have a private practice, and that would be my trajectory, which is an awesome trajectory. But what social work allows for is a lot of flexibility, because our field is so vast and so wide. And throughout our career, we have the opportunity to mix with different practitioners, different systems, different institutions. And so throughout my career, I started off as a child welfare worker because I was a Title IV or CalSWEC student back at San Francisco State. So I went right into the field of child welfare. And it was through that experience that I was able to intersect with different institutions, hospital settings, clinical settings, schools, and really saw how vast our profession is. And also that there were going to be opportunities that I wanted to take advantage of throughout my career. So I knew that while I loved working in the child welfare field, I also wanted to explore other opportunities. And so one of the things that I think I've learned, or most important things, is that social work is a vast field, an amazing profession that's going to provide you with multiple opportunities and opportunities to reinvent yourself over and over and over again, which is exciting because sometimes we can get bored, or we can get tired, or we can get overwhelmed. And so it's just, I think, important to know that our career provides plenty of opportunities. I have transformed myself from being a public child welfare professional to a mental health clinician, to a school-based worker, to an adjunct lecturer, to a doctoral student, to currently an assistant professor at Cal State Long Beach. And so I guess what I want to round that out by saying is our field is wonderful and wide, and allow yourself possibilities to explore any and all areas of our field that excite you.
Thank you. Benjamin?
Yeah, sure. To build on a lot of these great pieces of being open and the flexibility of our career, I had also my own direction too. I interpret this question a lot about what's most valuable from social work that I've learned that is unique to social work as compared to some of the other professions and professionals that we work with in the field, whether it's mental health or even different public health, et cetera. So the first is understanding that different problems or issues arise from tensions or transactions within our social environment, sociocultural and sociopolitical. That's been really beautiful to take home with me and to be able to look at through a critical lens about how we operate, whether it's delivering clinical services or even understanding different types of community and organizational issues that require different organizing and different advocacy. So understanding that things come to you through context with a broader social environment has been really nice. And I find that to be one of the most valuable things. And then the second is this anti-oppressive praxis lens, which I link to systems, and understanding how to look at things through with having critical awareness of the positionality that you hold in your role, if your identities in the different spaces that we serve, as well as critical self-awareness for your own awareness of that in the systems that we work in. And then critical self-reflexivity is understanding how you interact with all of that knowledge and how you have responded to and how you've been conditioned and with your own biases in this multicultural and diverse society. So that has been something that has been really beautiful in clinical settings and others where you might not find that perspective with other mental health professionals or even other program planners, et cetera. So I really take that as a gem from social work to live my life and be able to serve the communities and interact with people in a way that colors my life very richly from those three things.
Thank you for that. And Lizzie, hopefully you're able to join us.
Thank you so much for your patience. This was like a full-blown social anxiety exposure for me. I appreciate you all waiting.
So if you could just please introduce yourself and then I can reread the question for you.
Perfect. My formal name is Elizabeth, but I don't ever really go by it. My name's Lizzie. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And then anything about like where I work or anything that you need to hear, Jennifer?
Yeah, just a little quick background and yeah, where you are now.
Yeah, so I now have figured out like half and half. Most of my career is working with teenagers and kids, primarily on probation, or kind of dealing with higher levels of care, such as child welfare, residential. So a big goal of mine has been helping kids get back into their communities with their families and the people that they love. So that's been most of my work. And then I have worked a lot in hospital systems as well, in an OCD clinic. And right now I am working at Sharp Mesa Vista's Trauma and Recovery Program with primarily active duty military.
Thank you. And so the first question was, what is the most important thing that you have learned thus far in your experience as a social worker?
That's such a big question. I would definitely say being humble, like being humble and having a heart. And like, I love, like the first person spoke about just listening. I think that I really value like higher degrees. I really value advanced education, but I think so many people can have so many big letters after their name and truly not listen to a client in front of them. So I think it's really being humble and willing to listen to someone and hear their story is just so important. And then humble in the sense of my privilege and like my social location and where I come from, and just being humble about that, because some people I'm working with might not trust people that look like me, or social worker is a word that is not really a positive word in their home. Or they haven't had good interactions with a social worker. So just being like really humble about, where people are coming from and where I'm coming from, and just kind of owning that.
Thank you for that. Before I move on, I'd like to clarify for the guests who are joining us. If you have any questions, please hold off to the very end. We have some time spared if you have any questions. So moving on to the next question. How do you maintain self-care while balancing personal and professional priorities? Dr. Lovato.
Thank you, Jennifer. I've been thinking about this question so much. As I mentioned, my career has taken many different twists and turns, and I'm going to start a little bit further back when I was working as a child welfare worker in San Francisco County. I had a great position, and I had a heavy caseload, as you may all be familiar with, multiple responsibilities, and also at the time I was caregiving for my mom who was dealing with cancer. And an opportunity, or when I first became intimately aware of how critical self-care was kind of on a heavier note when my mom passed during that time. And I really felt like I needed to make a career shift for me because I was doing such intense clinical work, working with families who were in the midst of, you know, dealing with disruptions and attachment issues and loss and all of that. And so I really had to check in with myself to understand, was this healthy for me at the time? And so after finishing up my commitment to the CalSWEC profession, or to CalSWEC, I basically made a decision to pivot and to return back to my internship agency, which is well known in San Francisco. It's called Instituto Familiar de la Raza, and they work with Latinx families in different capacities. And I think I just checked in with myself to understand a little bit of what I needed. And at that time, what I really needed was a space that was going to be really nurturing. And, you know, not that child welfare can't be, but returning back to my internship where I loved and really admired role models who taught me how to be a clinician, just felt like the right thing to do. And if you know that agency, you know that they work with a model that's called La Cultura Cura, or Culture Heals. So I was able to also integrate for myself even ways in which cultural healing could assist me in working through some grief. And that was really powerful. And I think it just taught me to listen to what my needs were as a professional, as a person, and to sometimes make hard decisions, which could mean shifting and pivoting professionally. So that's kind of looking at the past. And then day to day, I took on a mindfulness practice. So I immersed myself in a 9-month course at UCLA, which is through their Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. And I decided to integrate mindfulness into my life. And that's been really amazing. It's a practice that you can access at any time. It's free. All you have to do is just return back to the present moment. And I know that seems a little cliche or sometimes hard to do, but when you can remember it, it really feels good. And it's just a great part of my day. So I, in the morning, you know, have a little mindfulness practice that I do. In the afternoon, a little practice as well, where I just think about, where am I at right now? How do I feel? So just bringing awareness to my body and mind. And then in the evening, I engage in a gratitude practice. And with one of my social work colleagues from child welfare, this is many decades ago, we send each other an email every night where when we don't respond to each other, but we just write something that we're grateful for that happened to us during that day. And that accountability is really helpful, and it keeps me focused on, you know, the present. Thanks for that question.
Thank you for starting us off. Benjamin?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I do for more concrete aspects so that you can get a sense, I live by my Google Calendar, so I really do that, and everything is color coordinated depending on different roles that I have. And I also schedule in time for recreation or different times with friends. So that is a visual for me for when I am looking at what my life looks like that week. And if there is missing a certain color, then that's an indicator that there is an overemphasis on some other domains. And obviously you can't control all of that, but it's something to, like what Dr. Lovato said, to be mindful of what it is that you're doing. This activates that for me, and to set an intention to engage in things like that. Another app that I have used or have been familiar with is the Fabulous app. It is from, I believe it is Duke's Center for Behavioral Economic Research, and it had evolved since, so the center may have changed now, but there's a lot of different tasks that you can do from that. And so that is more of through a scheduling lens through that way. The other is really setting aside one day where I do not really do work, and I keep that habit up so that it becomes more of a conditioned experience. So my body and mind can expect to turn off at this embodied level, because when you don't have that, you know, learned, then there can be a lot of the anxiety or stress that's just present throughout, because you're never really knowing when you're going to get that next break or sense of relief. So I do try to habituate a day or a specific time that is consistent, where I know that I can seek refuge away from a lot of these things. And I really do work to keep that a sacred space, just like you would in other areas and domains. And I also really enjoy the arts and different aspects there. So being able to engage with that with people is something that I do to help balance some of those things. And then really surrounding yourself with other social workers or other professionals, both inside social work and outside. Inside, because there are certain things that we experience and go through that it may not be as relevant for those outside. And so having your own group and squad to be able to interrelate and sometimes even commiserate, but then also not too much where there's hopelessness, but to be able to build upon and strategize and also feel supported and validated, that's, I found, has been really beautiful. So I'm a big believer in social capital in that way. And then to have friends outside of that so that you're not siloed in that world too long either, because there's other ways and other professions out there and other things that you can be thinking about and supporting other people and also just learning from too. So that's how I balance all of that. But it's, a work in progress too. So that's like my answer right now. And it may change a couple of years down the line. And it's always a work in progress. So I'll say, it's not really I have the perfect answer for this right now and it's going to solve everybody. It really is a work in progress.
You. And Lizzie?
This is such a complicated question. I would say work-wise, also just being able to acknowledge there are some jobs within the field of social work that are really not affirming to self-care and mental health. So I just want to empower you all for that, because there are some jobs that I've had where I like really tried to make it work or have a positive attitude. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that certain systems might have just too high of standards, or, I worked at one clinic where it was hourly and people would often clock out and keep working. And to me, that's like burnout central. So really just being able to know your worth and what makes you happy. And, maybe it's not working for a place that gives you an exceptionally high salary, but there's more work-life balance. So I just want to give you all permission to, I had a dream job at a certain place and I got there and was like, this isn't it. And that's okay. And just like having those options. The other thing I try to do is go on a walk on my lunch break. I've had a lot of jobs where everyone wants to talk on the lunch break, and I don't want to talk about my clients on my lunch break. Like I need a break. So that's one like little thing that I do is I just go on a walk on my lunch break just to give myself 30 minutes to myself to not talk about clients and trauma or whatever I'm doing. And then it's always a work in progress, but I roller skate, I play music, I sing. So just doing things that make me happy is really, really important. So yeah. And saying no. It's okay to say no, even if it makes someone upset, because that's going to help you not burn out in the long run.
Thank you, Lizzie. And Dr. Fitzgerald.
Well, I don't roller skate because I would kill myself. And I don't sing because you could be held liable for causing damage to others' eardrums. And I don't prefer lawsuits. So for me, with Lizzie, as she talked about, I'm totally in agreement with that, with this idea. And it took me a while to realize that knowing your worth. And if you're in systems, all social work is not equal, and all people who are within social work are not on the same playing field that you are as you think about social justice. So when you're inundated or surrounded by those individuals, and it increases the rate of burnout, when you are continuously fighting the good fight and strategizing, and you're surrounded by people who are looking at the clock or waiting for retirement, or they believe, I believe they got into the wrong line when we were deciding what we should do. When you're surrounded by those, it's bad for you. It's poisonous. You got to get out and find joy somewhere else. There's always going to be a fight. There's always going to be people who need you, but you also have to look out for yourself. I always use this analogy in class. Thinking of being on an airplane, and I would say, you know, Ryan, what do you do when the oxygen, you know, rolls out? And Ryan would say, I put the mask on myself. I go, no, yes, you put the mask on yourself, and then you're able to help others. If you're not able to take care of yourself, how are you able to help anyone else? So for me, it is learning when to say no, and learning when systems um, are going in the wrong direction and finding something else. But then again, you know, it's also I have to recall and remember when things get really tough, what my North Star is. And for me, my North Star is, why am I doing this? What has guided me through all, you know, storms, all weather conditions, that keeps me focused? And it's about making a difference and remembering that even when you make a difference, it could be small or it could be large. If you're moving forward in this bending the arc of justice, I feel that you're successful in remembering to thinking of increments as success. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to make these gigantic systems change within a day, but you're making increments with bending the arc of justice. And on the side, you know, I like to utilize my creativity and writing to sort of, if I can't change systems, creating worlds. With all this social work and education and race knowledge I have, and creating worlds that are communicating things that I wish all of us were doing. So it's like creating my own little laboratory and writing. And so that's one of the side things, other than running, like Forrest Gump, just running until I tire out and then I'm done.
And thank you all for sharing your self-care tips. Moving on to the third question. How did your social work practice expand or change over time? Consider populations of interest, work settings, positions, roles, scope of practice, etc. And we're going to start off with Benjamin.
Yeah, so this is really pulling at what Dr. Lovato says, that you can go anywhere and everywhere with social work. And so, you know, I initially was interested in social work because of the medical social work component of looking at the history and roots with different social casework and being able to infuse the socio-emotional and economic layers and understanding family systems within a health system. That evolved into, when I had discovered more pieces about social welfare and social justice, to broader things for systems change and macro work, right? And so that came a little bit later in my career, but the medical social work piece began with there, and then there was care coordination, and then other types of like program coordination and geriatric social work, supporting different older people and community aging in place. And I still love a lot of that. And that's what I thought that I really wanted to go into. And it still is something that I'm very passionate about. And I had plans to find an ideal geriatric social work position that would be able to allow me to have some interface within health systems, but then also community work. And the reality is, you know, with different types of careers in health and human services, there is a stream of funding. And from my experience, different geriatric social work and different aging populations, it's a smaller niche. And so there is funding there, but we as a society seem to be very late to the need and emerging needs of population aging. And so the funding is not necessarily as present as with other areas, which are still underfunded, you know, in health and human services, but like child welfare or substance use or addiction or et cetera. And so being able to have a variety of skills and be open to where the profession can take you has been valuable, because then where I hit a dead end for me for different positions that I was looking for within geriatric social work, there are a lot and different needs, but for what I was looking for specifically, some of what Lizzie's mentioned, you know, the structure of different new professionals at ASWs within different managed care organizations and et cetera, the management doesn't necessarily need to be strong, because there's always going to be a pool of us coming in. And so I didn't like that when there were a lot of direct practice positions. So I found myself being open to this role in clinical training and technology transfer, which was essentially public health social work. And so that came because of the opiate epidemic funding from SAMHSA and a lot of the problem framing there, which is also very racialized as well. As the opiate epidemic is, popularized because it started affecting different white individuals more. And we've had different drug and heroin and other addiction issues that were criminalized and framed very differently before in the 80s administration. So anyway, I'm now there in addiction and implementation science and public health social work there. And I also have gotten to nourish some of my other interests. I really like specifically clinical social work, psychodynamic therapy, and Jungian work. So that also is difficult within this CBT world. So I've had to carve that out on my own. And so that's taken me at this mental health startup at Cerebral, where I get to integrate different things that are cognitive and behavioral, but also things that I am deeply aligned with. And so are the people that I work with in looking at depth, insight, and relationships. So that's sort of a whirlwind of everything that has been my interest and what I've discovered along the way. And, based off of, it's not always a decision that you make, but it's some of the things that are within the broader cosmos or system that you're in and the needs there, and whether you can ride that wave and find meaning through some of those roles too. And they're not always going to be meaningful, but you can always learn through this whole process. So that's how I'll start the conversation there, building upon some of the things that everyone has said.
Thank you for starting us off. Lizzie?
Okay, how did practice? Okay. I think I always really wanted to do direct clinical work. I actually wanted to be a marriage family therapist. I think the younger Lizzie's like, I want a PhD, like that, nothing against PhD, but in clinical psych. And I really loved that I worked in mental health for 2 years before I got a master's. And it just was so humbling to meet with young men who hated therapy, but they would really open up with me when I played basketball with them outside or when I drove them in the car to their appointments. So I think working in the field really allowed me to not just see that there is so much change and direction that you can go with people without being confined into an office. So I think that kind of changed me, like being, I went to San Francisco State as well. In the beginning, like, oh, this is what I want to do. So just being really open-minded to different ways of serving others and just working in the community has been really helpful because it's allowed me to just try different things on. Forever it was just like, I want to primarily work with teenagers, and I think I've been in mental health since I was 23 and I'm going to be 35 soon. And now I'm working with adults. So it's just like being open-minded to try different trainings and work with different populations, because at the end of the day, everyone's human. So that's just been really cool to try different things on. I think like a common humanity and being humble has always been something that I really honor and is important to me. But really trying to make sure that I'm really still always trying to learn has been really important to me, because I don't know how to help everyone. Of course I don't. That's like very savior complex. But I think being humble enough to just want to learn how to serve specific needs, or, for instance, I got training in OCD and I'm so glad I did that because it's such a specific type of treatment. So I just think being open-minded to different populations and different roles is kind of what I've learned.
You. Dr. Fitzgerald?
For me, it was this idea of systems, going in and recognizing, again, my focus is looking at race and inequality, looking at how systems are highly connected as we think about oppression, and we think about how these ideas also gravitate toward other, or also embedded within other systems, and seeing how they're connected. So understanding that, as I think about schools, going in schools as a school social worker, I was thinking primarily schools, but then I began to see these connections with my students with the criminal justice system, and then it began with with mental health and and also physical health, and it went from there, and I began to see these intricacies of race and oppression, and how they were also embedded within these others, and also how they're connected. and how they play off of each other. So over my time was beginning to see the larger picture, the entire playing field as it relates to oppression versus the singular sort of approach. So simply that was it, beginning to see the systems connection between the systems.
Thank you. And Dr. Lovato.
Yeah, thank you. Really enjoying hearing the intricacies of all of your work. I would say I think I've started my career, I started my career moving 3,000 miles away from home. So I moved from the Bay Area to the South Bronx, and I started working in an agency that worked with families who were at risk of child welfare involvement. And at the time, I didn't know that this theme was going to span my career, but 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, I think I became intimately aware of the ways in which restrictive policies, such as immigration policies, impact the lives of my clients on an individual and very, very personal level. So at that time, much like today, immigrant populations were seen as profiled and seen as the other and seen as unwanted and sort of, in many of those ways, much like today, right? And that mirrored my own family experience. So I noticed that at the time, my mom and my grandparents who had come here from Mexico, they pretty much remained under the radar. And despite having needs, like social service needs, they did not want to access social service support for fear of being noticed. And so that connection for me was really powerful. And it really cemented my interest and passion in becoming a social worker. And after 9/11, I moved back home to the Bay Area, where I started my MSW career at San Francisco State, was a child welfare CalSWEC student, worked in the bilingual unit at San Francisco State, and again, noticed this theme of, how ways in which immigrant families were being persecuted due to disruptions and deportations and increased enforcement and really experiencing forced family separation. And this theme of forced family separation motivated me so much to want to make policy level changes that I moved on from child welfare to more clinical work, worked with families who were directly experiencing family disruption and forced family separations. And ironically, I had an experience to teach, to be an adjunct lecturer at San Francisco State. And, I had no knowledge at all of academia. My family, I was the first generation student, Latina student to go on to college. None of my family wanted me to go on to a PhD at all because they thought it was very unrealistic and how was I going to make money? But teaching at San Francisco State gave me a new experience, which again, I'm going to go back to the beauty of social work, which was to teach. And I fell in love with mentoring emerging social workers. And I felt this hunger to want to change policy and learn more about forced family separations that I knew I just couldn't do working part-time and adjuncting, and I needed that full immersive experience. So I went on to get my doctorate and focused my studies on immigration and family separation, which at the time, several years ago, which was a bit unheard of in social work. There wasn't a lot of emphasis. So I needed to go beyond social work into different fields like Chicanx studies, education field, and others to understand more how to, understand the problem of forced family separation. And so beyond this work, I would say my populations have pretty much always stayed the same. I have always had a passion and desire for working with immigrant Latinx families who've been at the intersections of child welfare and immigration enforcement. I never knew that this was actually an area that I could focus on in social work. No one said, you could just kind of focus on populations that are of interest to you. But I learned that I could and developed that on my own. And I'm really glad that I have. And that's what I've continued to work on as a professor. And I find that that's an important aspect of the work, and have developed an elective as well at Cal State Long Beach, which focuses on social work practice with Latinx populations. So I think just to say that it's important to be able to find your passion. It can change over time. It can evolve. And just like my colleagues here on this panel have said, many passions have remained and others have born into new ways. And so that's, I think, really exciting.
Thank you so much for sharing all your experience and knowledge and everything you all just said. Very amazing to hear how we're all very spread out, right, not in this field. So moving on to the next one, what is the greatest challenge that you have faced as a social worker, and how have you navigated through the experience? Lizzie, can you please start us off?
Okay. I think the greatest challenge, there's so many, but I think as a social worker, a big challenge that I have faced is one of them is managing your own countertransference or your own reactions to what's going around you. You know, some jobs are easier than others. I had one specifically where it was just so much every day, you know, it was a urgent care. And so that was probably my biggest challenge, was working in an urgent care, seeing people in such high needs and then putting a teeny Band-Aid on it and then saying goodbye. So I think my biggest challenge is finding a job where I feel good, like authentic in my heart, where the biggest challenge probably is finding a job where it feels sustainable and that I'm making a difference, because sometimes you're fighting against a lot of odds that are not favoring the people that you work with. So that has been a really big challenge for me. And I think the biggest challenge for me, it will always be, is educating myself about what my clients are going through, and making sure that I'm informed, whether just about my privilege or whether it's things like, you know, gender identity, being gender affirming, being affirming to people of color, being, you know, just being affirming to people who have disabilities. So really, like, the biggest challenge for me always will be continuing to just educate myself as much as possible. I'll never be culturally competent, but I can try to be culturally sensitive. So that'll always be like my biggest challenge, but in a great way.
Dr. Fitzgerald?
You know, for me, I think my biggest challenge is, geez, it's a hard one. It would be recognizing that what I'm doing is, am I making an impact? Am I making an impact? You know, race is an intricate thing as we think about. I mean, we see it playing out every day in one way or another, especially when we look at, you know, when we look at media and what's happening within your local community or nationally or internationally, and you begin to wonder if you're making a difference. I think that's my biggest challenge, is to continue to stay motivated, because this is so, I mean, it's way older than me, and in so many ways there are people who are these continuous barriers to this work that I'm doing. So it is staying motivated and trying not to lose the fire that, you know, that really propelled me into this area. Not only my own personal experiences, but watching how it played out for those who had no power, especially the youth. You're looking at children. And I think that's the only thing that continues to keep me going in the face of, like, again, what we're seeing today in our country, especially, is thinking about, if I give up, how will that affect those children? That's the only thing that's keeping me motivated. It isn't man, because man has continuously disappointed us. Our profession has continuously disappointed me as it relates to this topic, with this pseudo facade of true diving into, or really dealing with the issues around power and oppression. We've done a disservice to those who are in need. We have. We're one of the biggest barriers to change. So also fighting that as well, when you're surrounded within a system that says they're for one particular thing, or they're for social justice, but their actions prove otherwise. And the people in the universities prove otherwise. And the people on the ground prove otherwise who are call themselves professionals. It's hard. It's hard. But I keep going because of those children, not because of man, and definitely not because of our profession.
Thank you. Dr. Lovato.
Thank you. This is a great question. I think building off of what Dr. Fitzgerald said, I think there's an inherent tension in our profession in the sense that we all want to be change agents, and yet our field has a history of being one in which social workers have been social control agents, right? And so that's a tension I think that I've wrestled with at various institutions in which I've worked, larger institutions such as the public child welfare agencies, where that has been an agency that has been firmly rooted in policing rather than providing. And yet at the same time, I worked in units that were really wonderful, where I was surrounded by other bilingual colleagues who had social justice values and passions, and they were rooted in justice. Yet, I think that tension is inherent in our profession. And so I think what I would say about that is it's important, like our colleagues have said on the panel, to continue to fill your bucket and also your professional bucket with other aspects that are fueling you. And so if you find that your agency is not rooted in the same values, you can shift, you can make changes, you can add in components like doing consulting work or doing art therapy, play therapy, doing whatever it is that feeds you. You can bring that into your own toolbox and make your passion, your career come to life in ways that maybe you haven't learned to do before. So again, going back to the fact that social work is multidimensional and you can build the kind of career that you want to build. It may take some work to find out what that is and some exploration, but it's really worth it.
Thank you. And last but not least, Benjamin.
Yeah, I will say, from my perspective, some of the biggest challenges as a social worker would be, like everybody has said here, the systems and agencies that we exist within. I would, in my perspective, say that the work, while being very difficult and heavy, working with different historically disenfranchised populations or marginalized groups, it's difficult, but from my experience and all the people that I know and colleagues, there is a lot of compassion and passion and devotion and service to the communities, where I don't really see that as being more of the challenge that has arose in our lives. The biggest challenge is the systems we operate within that create different organizational dysfunction, poor management, poor team dynamics, and different aspects that can interfere with the delivery of services, whether that's going to be different institutionalized racism within a social work field that has a diversifying set of young professionals that are emerging, or if it is just poor management from the lack of training from different professionals. It's something that I learned very on, is that the organization is as much the client or patient as is the individual. And really being able to work through that is, for me, looking at through macro social work, as well as different organizational dynamics and team dynamics trainings and different things that can come from like industrial psychology, but really it's still different because you are still a social worker engaged in the work while also having to contextualize what it is that you're working within. We have both hats. It's not like we're just therapists, we're just program manager. It's a lot of the times it's all of it together, and everybody just assumes that you can take care of everything. So navigating through a lot of that has been understanding and orienting myself to every single organization that I work with and different communities as a patient or a client in that way, and understanding how you would approach this, meet them where they're at, and understand how to work with different folks, looking at unconscious dynamics within teams. The work environment is a ripe place for things to repattern, not just between the clients and people and yourselves and the people that we serve, but your managers, your supervisors, your different consultants, other folks. And so that has been, I would say, the biggest challenge, because that interacts and can interfere with the delivery of services for people who are excited and already devoted to the communities. Oftentimes the institution and work politics, et cetera, and team dynamics can not, they may not be doing their job to facilitate or catalyze the work as much as we had hoped. And that can damage morale and interfere with motivation, as well as sustainment of different work. That's why there's so much burnout. That's why there is high turnover, you know? So that's what I would say is the big challenge, and being conscientious of that, working with that, and having more discussions about that has been very helpful and central to my work, and working now with organizations to help build capacity in that way and acknowledge these types of challenges that happen at the systemic level.
Thank you for being vulnerable and being and sharing your very honest responses to the challenges that you all have experienced. So we're going to move on to the last question that the committee has for you all. And it is, how do you balance your altruistic nature, responsibilities, and ethical obligations as a social worker with the capitalistic demands of our society? And Dr. Fitzgerald, please start us off.
Be the one to start off on this one. Jeez, what a question. So if I'm getting this correct, it's, you know, how do we balance doing good over the need to make money? Is that essentially it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, speaking from poverty, let's say, you know, as we think about this, as I've gotten older, you know, I remember first starting, I could just tell you this. I remember when I first started, yeah, I was used to poverty because I grew up in poverty, and being a grad student, it wasn't a big transition. But I remember thinking, you know, when I was really getting into it, I was like 29 with this PhD, and I'm also, you know, working in the field. I remember that certain things were important to me. It was about making this, you know, it was about making a difference, and stealing toilet paper and tuna from my mother's house, you know, once a week. You got used to it. But then, you know, you get to this point as well where you start thinking about your worth, and you start thinking, you know, I bring a large amount of talent, especially when I'm thinking about schools, to these situations in which they find themselves in. As we think about inequalities, we think about the needs of kids. And then you start thinking, you know, I deserve, you know, what I'm paid, or I deserve to be paid for what I bring to the table. So you begin to elevate your thinking about what you bring. One of the things I always tell my students is to know your value. You having a particular skill set, a focus, a willingness to do a job where others do not want to or don't want to do, to know that you bring value, and to know that even in our profession, people will use you or misuse you, overwork you, underpay you because they feel they can. But to know your value, at least, I'm not saying, you know, you're striving for a Ferrari, but you strive to be valued and paid for what you're worth. And never forget that what you bring to the table is important. If you don't believe in yourself and the value that you bring, no one will see that, and no one will pay you for what you're worth. That's the only way I can answer that particular question.
Thank you. Thank you for your honest response. Dr. Lovato?
Sure. When I think about this question, which has to do with the capitalistic demands of our society, I'm thinking a little bit more broadly, in addition to the economic piece, but also just the ways in which I think we're sent messages to to sort of aspire to different things, right? Whether it's like a different body image or a different like way of life, or I don't know, just just betterment, and that, you know, we're sort of not enough. And I think as is, and I think going back to cultural values and the way in which I was raised is like, you know, simple is good and being humble is great. And I'm not really that engaged on social media for that reason, because I feel like it just doesn't make me feel that good at the end of the day. So I think like returning back to what makes you feel good. You know, the friends you keep, the family members that you're in touch with, like the activities that you do that make you feel good, just surrounding yourself with goodness. I think that humbles us all and brings to mind what's important in life. And I think for me, it means like just getting down to the basics. I love, you know, certain things. I like to keep fit. I like to play sports. I like good music and good food. And I like to work hard. And so those things keep me motivated, humble, and I think focused on what it is that I'm passionate about. And the rest of it, I try to kind of keep out.
Thank you. Benjamin?
Yeah, I am so excited. This is my favorite question of the whole 4 or 5 that we've answered. So I'm really excited to share this. You know, I think about this a lot, especially with the different attitudes towards work. So I will say, you know, this all began for me in thinking about how I would sustain myself in this type of profession to prevent or work with compassion fatigue, as well as burnout and different types of economic challenges, because as it is clear that, you know, social work is a very needed profession, and it's different. It's not a business in the sense that you are in it to make money in other, like you would find in other professions or bubbles in different types of areas and sectors like the private sector. So I think about this a lot. And one of the things that this began comes back to gerontological and gerontology and different types of geriatric social work, because there is and has been, at least for me, this conscientization about how we approach work. Because when we're looking at population aging, you know, the retirement system as it was designed was when life expectancy was a certain age that was not that much longer than the retirement age. Now that it is at least 20 years over for most people, I've thought about this a lot, because I cannot imagine myself working for that many more decades in the same manner that I have been within these systems that are continuously fragmented and broken in this way. And I'm not sure how much effort it will require for me to constantly change and work with other people. I want to be able to do that, but I also want to be able to sustain that. So through that lens of looking at how we orient ourselves towards work, there has been a shift in different aging fields of looking at whether we might either work longer, but not as intensely packaged as we have thus far. And that really led me down the road to finding a movement within a lot of like millennial communities, but the financial independence and retire early. And this concept of retirement, not as an age, but as a number. And so that has been a wealth of information to understand how to build your wealth, because as social workers, we're not really taught how to build our wealth. And some people get into business and private practice and coaching, and they have to learn business skills. So that's an avenue into that, but really being able to surround yourself. This is why I said at the beginning, not just with social workers, or if it is with social workers, have that entrepreneurial mindset, but different types of folks that can give you more insight into the other ways people live and work. And so being able to understand how to make your money work for you, whether that's through investment or through different types of wealth management, and building that so that ultimately what I want to do is I do want to have this early retirement, not so that I'm just going to do nothing, but so that I can continue to do this work that I love without having to depend on it for my own economic security and money. And so there's a great, I don't remember what the blog was, but there's a therapist that had done this, and a variety of different people, where she had, and she wouldn't necessarily call it her retire early, but figuring out how to shell away certain seed money to grow with the market, so that that's making money and you're not necessarily using all of that, but she gets to see maybe 8 patients a week and do different community work, and you don't have to charge the maximum rate. You can do it based off of what that person needs, because it's no longer then dependent on the capitalistic demands of your own survival. And so she can still generate over 6 figures, but only like 30 or 40,000 of that is from direct practice or different things in the community. And so I do hope to attain that for myself, so that I can do pro bono work, volunteer with local community organizations and aging organizations, and do the work that speaks to my heart, and then do other creative avenues too, to help communities in ways that I don't have to depend on the funding or different types of trends or bubbles that require me to stay afloat in this capitalistic sea, right? And so really that's what I do to sustain the work here. So thank you.
Thank you. Lizzie?
I love Dr. Fitzgerald, what you said about knowing your worth, because I do private practice on the side, and it's just knowing sometimes, are you accepting, I was seeing Medi-Cal as well, and my reimbursement rate was really low, and I was getting really burnt out. And so I was so happy to provide that service, but it's just kind of knowing how much time do I want to spend on this, or like knowing that your time is valuable, and knowing like how much are you worth, in the sense of, I know this, are you going to offer a rate that is so exceptionally low that maybe you're burnout and you're bitter, and that's not fair to the client. So it's also just knowing your worth and what you're okay being paid, and being okay with that, and feeling confident that that is also going to help you be a better provider. And just valuing your time as a human, I think, can be really helpful. I also think one way that I balance it is like working within hospital systems. I have no problem really advocating for my clients' needs when it comes to insurance. Like, I don't feel guilty arguing medical necessity in order to get someone's needs met. You know what I mean? Just like learning how to use some of these systems, not in an unethical way, but learning how to really utilize some of the resources that are there, so that you can help people. I don't know if that's capitalistic, but I believe, learning how to work with insurance or different funding sources is really, really important. But I think the biggest thing is knowing your worth and how much time you want to spend, and being okay setting a limit, and being like, you know what, I've had a lot of colleagues that are like, 1 day a week, I'm just going to do cash pay. And that, that's okay. And allowing yourself that, if that you feel like that's going to fill your cup more, and you're going to be less burnout. Or knowing like, maybe I don't want to accept Magellan because it's a nightmare, right? Or whatever insurance it is. So just knowing that it's okay, and you're not a terrible human being if certain systems are just like so much red tape that it's causing you burnout. So I think that's just important.
Thank you so much for answering all the committee questions. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge and your wisdom. So now we're going to move on to some of the questions from the audience. But before we do that, audience, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will facilitate those. And before we do that, I'm going to hand it over to Crystal.
All right, so we're going to take a group picture. So if everyone, I know it's through Zoom, but if you guys can all like try to turn on your camera and say cheese or something, or 23Strong. I'll start taking the picture. I'll give everyone some time to turn on their camera, and me and Lily will turn on the camera. We'll take the picture. Just giving people a minute more. Just for a little bit. Okay. Lily, are you ready too? Yeah. Okay. So if you guys can just smile for a bit, I'm just gonna start taking them. Okay, got 1, 2. All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Crystal. We're all going to be social media famous with all these pictures. Okay. Okay, so there was a question asked earlier. Question. Was there a point within your career that you wanted to turn your back on social work? And how did you work through the challenges that came up? Dr. Fitzgerald.
You know, I was answering that question, and I believe that it is. I'm actually going through it currently, but I would frame it this way: it isn't social work per se. It is remembering that what you got into, or why we got into this game of social justice, why we got into this, and if a particular venue is no longer viable, what else could you do that still makes a difference, that still pushes, you know, the agenda of social justice, of making, again, bending that arc of justice and finding another route. Social work per se, let's say, you know, from academia standpoint or clinical, isn't the only way. There's multiple ways of making differences. And I think in the 21st century, we need to really expand our ideas as we think about this. One of the things, you know, for those of you who may be really creative, you know, let's say, for example, utilizing media or utilizing forms of media to convey these messages of what we know, of telling stories and truths of other people, educating people about these issues: sex trafficking, inequality, homelessness. There's multiple ways of making a difference. You know, we have to no longer think about this one-on-one or policy standpoint of, I'm talking to a legislator in order, or we're attempting to somehow push this legislator to creating laws or policies that affect this population. But how do we educate the world about homelessness? How do we educate the world about sex trafficking, something that no one wants to talk about? How do we do that with all of this social work knowledge that we have and make a difference? I'd rather do that than to
No, I think he froze.
there we go with, again, smart people attempting to outsmart each other versus making a real difference on the ground, improving the circumstances of people and educating people, a little bubble we call academia.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fitzgerald. Dr. Lovato.
I have not experienced the desire to leave social work, but I have experienced, as I've mentioned throughout, the desire to shift and to pivot and to take on new opportunities, and just, again, encouraging you all to obviously explore all opportunities that come your way. Yes, burnout is real, and it is likely that it will happen to you at one point or another, and you can make great choices for yourself and continue to have different kinds of streams of income, like Benjamin said, or different kinds of innovative approaches, like Dr. Fitzgerald said, or like Lizzie shared, different ways in which we take care of ourselves so that we know our value and worth. So I haven't experienced that desire to leave, because ultimately social justice and change is what I always am centered on and want to do, but I can see the reality of that. And I think by expanding your networks, by developing social capital, by taking advantage of so many opportunities for training, you're going to build your knowledge around what it is that fills you. And hopefully that can foster a career that you feel is sustainable for the rest of your life.
Thank you. Benjamin.
I have definitely thought about this or been confronted with this dilemma many times, but I also am such a proud social worker. I love, live, breathe, and, you know, surround myself with the social work. So it's something that I think has called me to it. So I really do love it and have such an intimate relationship with it, but that's coexisting with all of these other confrontations. And, you know, one of the things is because I have a lot of friends that work in tech, that has been really the presenting or precipitating event as to why this would confront more frequently, because when you see the sheer amount of like number in terms of money that is being thrown at individuals with not that, there may be a lot of different assets and needs and training that they do have, but it's very different than going through this social work route. So there's been many times where I have reevaluated that, because there is just an obscene amount of money thrown at this tech bubble that is like 6 figures for different starting positions that you wouldn't even find until you're at 10 years into the health and human services. So what I have done is really in that domain, limit my interactions with those types of individuals in terms of exposure to that world, just because the more you're exposed to that, the more you're going to compare. And then there is underlying looking within of, you know, figuring out how to understand, I think about, you know, the grass is green where you water it. And so it's not always green on the other side, though certainly the cash flow is certainly green in tech, but, you know, being able to reflect about, this is your journey here, this is my journey here, and this is like calling here in this way I feel for my life, and investing your time into that instead of spending through a utilitarian lens of looking at the utility of how much worth it is it for me to spend all this time thinking about what I could pivot into doing versus what I'm already doing now and pouring that into this moment. Talking about the mindfulness that Dr. Lovato said, being able to be present in the moment and comfortable with that. And that takes a lot of work too. You really will have to encounter all of the regrets or things that you wish you had done, and figuring out what has led you here and easing into that. And the answer is not going to be that for everybody that you're going to be staying here. For me, it has been that this is what I want to do. And I have poured my energy and life into this. And so that has been really helpful in that way. And then, you know, having other ways where you can think about, okay, if I was to pivot, there's so many things you can do with the MSW as transferable skills to be able to pivot into different directions. There's civic technology, other types of social impact. I met with one of the NASW California, Los Angeles chapter technology individuals, and she had started carving out her space in different types of human-centered design, because there's a lot of different social impact that people are doing in tech and other more lucrative, or at least the bubble now, that social workers can have, because there's a familiarity with social responsibility and different social conscious movements and philanthropy and different things like that. So there are so many transferable skills that you can do. And then there is the reality that some individuals, you do grow out of the profession and it's no longer a fit in your life. And that, you know, as scary or unsettling as that may be part of your path. And, you know, you may not be ready for it, but that's also something that is out there in the cosmos. And if that is, I know people where they've moved on from it too. But I will say they still kept their social work values and skills, because what you've learned, I really think that everybody should have some sort of social work curriculum to be a conscious human being. So, you know, it's a skill and it's a richness to my life that I wouldn't trade ever, no matter how much money you placed on it. And so that's something that anchors me, that it really is essential knowledge to be a person on this world. And we have so many people making money, and business people and bankers, et cetera. And really, we do need more of these storytellers and people who are emotionally intelligent and conscious about that. You cannot replace emotions and human connection with technology either. So there will be a bubble burst at some point there too. So that's how I've sort of reconciled some of those pieces with our current demands of our time and what's trending in our capitalistic society.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions in the chat. So this is just an open forum. So if you feel comfortable answering these questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. So the following question is, what opportunities, if any, are there other than hospice or intensive outpatient services for geriatric social work or working with seniors, if possible, in a clinical sense?
I can answer this very quickly. So, you know, there are adult day health centers. There in California, you have multi-service MSSPs, which are multi-service sites that provide different services, whether that's field service or at a center. There are emerging themes within California called PACE programs. Those are programs for all-inclusive care for the elderly. There is a startup company from Florida that is called PAPA that basically is helping connect different neighbors with neighbors and be able to deliver home-based care through the private sector and tech. There are in non-clinical ways, California is having its master plan on aging, which is going to change the way that we deliver services. I don't know how long that is going to take, and I don't certainly want to wait around that long, but that's another area more in the non-clinical domains. And then you also have another one that you want to write down is that I discovered a year ago, which is Blue Moon Senior Counseling. That was a small business created out of Chicago for different consortium of geriatric social workers to be able to provide therapy and home-based care locally across the nation. So that's a really nice one. And I hope that more agencies like that will pop up. So those are some of the things that just come to mind for me for that aging space there.
Thank you. The next question is, how far into your career did you become comfortable or confident in your role? Any helpful tips?
I'm waiting for the day that I'm really confident. I can't wait for it. That's probably I should have probably said that's one of my biggest struggles, is always just wanting to make sure, now that I'm in a supervisor role with some students and people collecting hours, I'm like, okay, I got to own this. But I think it's okay to never feel 100% comfortable. But I also think it's important to feel competent with certain skill sets, especially if you're, when it comes to safety so there's certain skill sets that I feel really comfortable in, but I've been in many different roles. And of course it takes, I did wraparound, I think for 2.5 years, and it took about a year and a half to be like, I know what I'm doing. So I just give yourself permission to, anxiety can be a barrier with therapists not being confident, but it's interesting because I also think being overly confident can be kind of scary too. And I work with some people who are so confident. And I think it's also important to seek consultation and to, try to learn from the people around you. So I'm confident, but I don't know if I'm ever going to be like, I'm 100% know exactly what I'm doing 100% of the time.
Do you have any advice for those of us starting out our careers? For example, how to get your foot in the door in your chosen path?
I can start that off really briefly. I think it's important if you have the opportunity to have an internship, if you have any opportunity to have say in where you're placed in your internship, if you have that capacity, make it known to your field director or whomever that there's something that I'd like to try out. If you don't have that capacity, then I would say if you can volunteer. I know it's hard because everyone's time is challenged, but if you have the opportunity to volunteer, even if it's just a few hours, maybe a week, maybe it's 4 hours a week, or to try on just informational interviewing. I know that's kind of an old school technique, but people love to talk about what they do. And if you called any of us up and asked us, do you have a few minutes to talk about your career and how you got started? I think that could be informational at the least, and it could also, at the best, lead to more connections and potential entryways into a specific agency. So I'll leave it at that and let my colleagues add more.
We just have one last question that we want to close off with. What is something that you would like to see change within the social work profession?
Take that. for me, it would be really be taking a, I think we've lost some of our mojo as we think about social justice. There was a time in our profession where we were not, it wasn't not uncommon to see us in the front lines as we think about social movements. But when I think about, we can all think of, relatively recent movements, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. We think about what's happening in Texas right now with trans students. Where are we? Where are we as a group? We should be front line. We should be there. We should be in the faces of legislators. We should be there supporting and advocating, even if it isn't our interest area. I was reading one of the questions about, wanting to focus within your own group and not feeling guilty about leaving others out. Even if it isn't my area of interest, I'm committed. I'm married to, no, I shouldn't say married. My wife is still awake. I am committed to and connected to this idea of justice, wherever it is. It's like Tom Joad, the song of Bruce Springsteen, wherever injustice is, there I am. So yeah, I have an interest in men of color, but wherever injustice is, I know I should be there. And we all should have that same take as well. Even if your area is with the LGBT community, but we're seeing atrocities happen against Asian Americans, physical violence, and the lack of support within from legislators or local police or local government. We should be there as a group. If we're talking about issues around killings of Native people on Native lands, and we think about police shootings, what I mean by with Native populations, we should be there, even if it isn't my area of focus. We are connected with this hand of oppression. We've lost that connection. We have people who are thinking about, legitimizing social work as a science. We have others who are thinking about private practice. We have others who are off in their own little silo, and they neglect these other groups. And our organization as a whole has done this. We should be there. We should have been there, Me Too. We should have been there for Black Lives Matter. We should be there for Native people. And even during COVID, the inequalities that were existing, where were we? We're seeing all these other professionals, these other people who are, being asked questions or being interviewed. Why aren't we there? Because we've taken this lackadaisical approach. We've become lazy in social justice as a group. Not all of us here, but as a group, we've become lazy. And we need to get off the couch and get back in the fight.
Thank you so much for all your tips, all your knowledge, and for sharing all your experiences. We do apologize for not being able to address all the questions that were asked, but if you panelists, if you're comfortable to share your contact information so that if anybody has questions, they can reach out to you. We would really appreciate that.
No, I refuse that. I'm just kidding, of course.
Thank you so much again. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom and just for being here. You're educating social workers across the state. So we're very honored to have you here tonight. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you all.